Understanding. Understanding the fork. To understand the meaning of the fork, one has to understand the context in which the fork is being used. Lacking context, or when taken completely out of context, the fork might only have form and material significance, assuming you're already familiar with the shape and materials. This is to say that regardless of the context, I can likely perceive the fork's shape and perhaps recognize the material the fork is made from. But the fork itself is meaningless. Without an understanding of the context in which I perceive the form, the fork itself has no meaning. Now, your first reaction might be to say, how can that be true? I can see that that is a fork. And that's true. You recognize it as a fork because you've had previous experiences with forks. But to define that artifact that you see in front of you as a fork is to imply that you're couching your perception of it in a context. What is the context? Well, in this case, the context might be to provide that artifact with that particular shape, the name fork. The fork's meaning in this case is to take on the assignment of the name fork. Because I'm using a common artifact, a fork, as an example, it might be a bit difficult to recognize how important context is. But if you had never seen a fork before without knowing some of its contexts, it simply wouldn't be a meaningful artifact. Let me use this artifact as an example. What is it? What's it used for? How is it used? In what sorts of situations might it be used? How do we experience this with our body? Let me put some context to this, and you'll probably get a good idea of what it is and what it means. But simply knowing the name probably won't give you enough context to make it meaningful. The name of the object, this object, is an exolever, or a standard exolever. Not enough context yet? It's used to dig out roots. A modified elevator for the extraction of roots. Still not enough context? What if I say this? This artifact means something different for the dentist than it does for the patient. At least it did in the 1800s. Now, roots probably take on a whole new meaning. Now, take a look at this other artifact. Given that you are thinking 19th century dentistry, you probably have enough context to have a good idea that this is a tooth extractor. Of course, if you had no knowledge of dentistry, you still might not have sufficient context to understand what the object is. Context is necessary for understanding. Simply providing labels to things isn't. If we want to understand artifacts, we have to have knowledge of context. Not only that, to be educators, we have to be able to articulate what we mean by understanding. Here are the modalities necessary to understand an artifact, as far as instrumental understanding goes. You'll notice that each modality, form, material, purpose, function, and affordances, is coupled with the term embodied. I say embodied because each modality is experienced with or by our bodies. We are embodied, and as we'll see, every variation, or in other words, every different context in which the artifact is experienced, will have each of these modalities. However, each of these modalities will appear differently depending on the context, accounting for different embodied experience. Our exolever will be experienced very differently if we use it in the garden or in a person's mouth. Let's look at the modalities. we have embodied form. This is how we feel the shape of the artifact or the pattern and structure of the artifact through perception and movement. Perhaps it's a visual sense of what the object is. We have embodied material. That's how the physical substance of something is encountered through sensation and manipulation. We have embodied purpose. This is how the intent or the goal, the in order to do something, is felt or enacted through lived activity. And we have embodied function. This is how something works, as experienced or enacted in use. And finally, we have embodied affordances, how we perceive possibilities for action through direct interaction with the world. Now, if the context were simply to name the artifact, our fork in this case, the form, material, purpose, function, and affordances take on unique meanings. For example, in order to name something, we have an embodied form. This is a recognizable shape. In the case of the fork, we have a handle and prongs. But the form also perturbs our bodily senses in our recognition of how the hand feels, the curve, the weight, the balance, how the eyes trace the silhouette. We have embodied material. This is tactile properties of wood, steel, or perhaps plastic. The coldness of the metal, the lightness of the plastic. These materials also affect how it's gripped, washed, or used. And we have our embodied purpose. In this naming context, the purpose is to fix a symbol, the word fork, to this particular form, presumably allowing for communication and recognition. And we have embodied function. This is action of labeling. By saying this is a fork, we attach a category to an object. And embodied affordances. Once the name fork is learned, students can extend it to other variations of fork if the similar object appears. For example, a salad fork, a plastic fork, carving fork. The name provides an affordance for generalization, but also risks limiting thinking if only the name is known. You can probably sense just how limiting this labeling activity is in terms of understanding. While being able to name an artifact does provide us with the knowledge of the name, it does little else in terms of understanding. While this may seem obvious, it's still a practice that goes on in schools regularly. Not only is it bad practice, but it is, strangely enough, supported and promoted by a larger school context. I refer to this as the contextual nexus. The teacher and those accepting this behavior are dwelling within a context of labeling that is supported and promoted by the schooling contextual nexus. Without articulating the 5 modalities and ensuring that students have knowledge of each and every modality, we may find ourselves inadvertently schooling students rather than educating them. What do I mean by this? Well, simply, understanding is contextual. Context confers meaning. Education is the achievement of a depth and breadth of understanding. In other words, the recognition of a number of variations. Often students come to know a few of the modalities. Thus, they might have particular knowledge, but lacking all the modalities, they lack understanding. Furthermore, their understanding lacks depth and breadth if their variational understanding is limited. And here's the twist. While it might appear that we are learning about the artifact or the processes, we are actually learning about context so that our artifacts are meaningful. Why does this matter in schools? Well, in our classroom or school settings, when we reduce our teaching to naming artifacts, as probably seems obvious, we give students a very narrow sliver of one or two modalities. Furthermore, this naming is detached from lived experience. Importantly, students don't feel what makes a fork, nor do they know how the design, the material, and use are all part of what gives the fork significance and meaning. The flawed nature of this scenario might seem obvious, but this labeling is common. We see it often showing up when students are asked to explain commonly used artifacts like pi or gravity or circuits or democracy. More on that later.